He controlled an entire city. Factories, supply chains, union contracts, all of it moved when he decided it should move. In every room he walked into, people stopped talking and started listening, not because they were afraid, because they recognized something in him that most people spend their whole lives trying to find. But here is what nobody in that city knew. Every morning at 5:47, before the meetings, before the decisions, before the suit, without a single wrinkle, this man stood at his window, holding a pill he could not bring himself to take. And the person slowly destroying him from the inside was the one person he had trusted with everything for 20 years. Then a woman found a number that did not add up, and everything that had been buried for 15 years started coming to the surface. This channel is about one thing. Some people are born to lead, and there are lessons that no classroom, no book, and no mentor will ever teach you, lessons that only the ones who have really held power, really lost it, and really had to choose who they are. Those are the only ones who know. This channel does not tell crime stories. This channel tells you about mindset, about real strength, and about the secrets behind power that most people never get close enough to see. What this story will give you is something rare. It will show you the difference between controlling people and earning their loyalty, between being feared and being trusted, and why the strongest person in any room is sometimes the one who finally admits what they have been hiding. If that is the kind of story you are here for, stay with us. And if it moves you the way we think it will, leave a comment telling us which moment hit you hardest. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe so you never miss what comes next. The story starts now.
A man who controls an entire city learns two things early. First, what other people are afraid of. Second, how to make sure they never find out what he is afraid of. Marcus Vale had known both of those things since he was 26 years old. Now, at 48, standing in front of a floor-to-ceiling window on the 22nd floor of his Detroit apartment, watching the city shift from black to gray-silver before the sun had decided to show up, he was practicing the second one. The coffee in his right hand was still hot. He hadn't touched it. His left hand was in the pocket of his robe, his thumb turning something small and smooth in slow circles. A pill. White, smaller than his thumbnail. He'd been carrying it for 8 months. He had not taken it this morning. He had not taken it the morning before that either. He pulled it out and looked at it in his palm. The city below kept moving. Delivery trucks, early commuters, a bus pulling away from a stop. Detroit didn't care who was standing up here watching. That was the only thing Marcus had ever genuinely respected about this place. It didn't need his permission to keep going. He put the pill back in his pocket. He drank the coffee. By 7:15 he was dressed. Charcoal suit, white shirt, no tie until he needed one. He moved through the apartment the way he moved through every space he occupied. Like the room had been arranged specifically for him, which in most cases it had been. His driver was waiting at 6 minutes past 7. They didn't speak. They never needed to. The Vale Industrial Group occupied the 18th floor of a building on Woodward Avenue. Not the top floor. Marcus had turned down the top floor when he first leased the space 12 years ago. The top floor was for people who wanted to be seen. Marcus preferred to be found. The conference room that morning held 9 people. Quarterly review of 3 subsidiary contracts, 1 union renegotiation, and a logistics realignment in the Western Distribution Corridor. Marcus sat at the center of the long table, not at the head of it. Another small detail that most people never noticed, and that he had chosen with considerable deliberation. On the table in front of him, placed there before he arrived, was a glass water bottle. His own. Not from the building's filtered system. Leon had been doing this for 20 years, placing the bottle before Marcus arrived so it would be at the right temperature by the time the meeting started. 20 years of that particular habit, and Marcus had never once thought to question it. That would change. But not yet. He was listening to a presentation from a man named Connors, who ran the day-to-day operations of Greystone Industrial, one of 5 companies in the northern supply chain. Connors was good at his job and nervous around Marcus, which was a functional combination. Marcus. Page 14. Third column. That number is wrong. Connors stopped mid-sentence, turned to page 14, found the third column. His face changed. Connors. I apologize. I'll have the corrected figures to you by end of day. Marcus. Before lunch. Connors. Before lunch. No one else in the room said anything. That was how most of Marcus's corrections landed. A single statement, a brief adjustment, and then the meeting continued. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Midway through the second agenda item, with the union representative from Local 412 making his case about the overtime provisions, Marcus's left hand was resting flat on the table. He felt it before he could stop it, a slight tremor, barely visible, running through his fingers like a current. He placed his right hand over it. 1 second. The tremor stopped. He moved his right hand back and continued listening. The union representative hadn't noticed. Nobody had. After the meeting ended and the room emptied, Marcus stayed behind. He sat alone in the quiet of the conference room and looked at his left hand. He turned it palm up, then palm down. Studied it for 10 full seconds, the way you study a problem you already know the answer to but haven't decided to accept yet. Then he stood, buttoned his jacket, and walked out. Leon Ashby was waiting in the hallway. He always was. Leon was 52 years old, lean, with silver hair that had gone completely white by his mid-40s and pale blue eyes that looked gentle from a distance. He was the kind of man who could stand in a room full of people and be simultaneously the most dangerous person there and the one you'd least suspect of it. He had been Marcus's right hand for 20 years. The person Marcus told things to that he told no one else. The person Marcus trusted without question. That would change too. But not yet. They walked together toward Marcus's private office. Leon's report was brief, as his reports always were. 3 items. The last one was Greystone. Leon. We have a situation with the independent auditor on the Greystone contract. A woman named Sonia Cross. She's been engaged for 3 weeks and she's thorough. More thorough than most. Marcus. What has she found? Leon. Nothing conclusive, but she's methodical. She'll keep pulling threads. Marcus stopped at his office door. Looked at the city through the glass wall at the end of the corridor for a moment. Marcus. Handle it quietly. Leon. Always. He said it the same way he always said it. Certain. Comfortable. The confidence of a man who has handled 1,000 things quietly over 20 years and never once been told he'd done it wrong. Marcus went into his office. Leon followed briefly to place the afternoon's water bottle on the corner of the desk, the right corner, exactly 30 centimeters from the coffee cup, the position it had occupied every afternoon for as long as either of them could remember. Leon's hand rested on the neck of the bottle for 1 beat before he released it. Just 1 beat. Then he straightened and left. Marcus sat down, looked at the water bottle, picked it up, took a long sip, turned back to his work. On the other side of Detroit, in a small rented office on the 5th floor of a shared workspace building in Midtown, a woman named Sonia Cross was finishing her second coffee of the day and staring at 2 numbers that refused to agree with each other. The Greystone Industrial Audit was her 12th engagement of the year. Medium-sized manufacturer, regional distribution, nothing that had flagged on the surface screening. Standard work. She'd expected to be done with the preliminary pass in 10 days. But this number in the third quarter payment ledger was off by 0.3%. Not off in a way that suggested error, off in a way that suggested choice. She opened a new search tab and typed the name of the small company in the corresponding vendor column. Incorporated 6 months ago. Director listed as a name she didn't recognize. Registered address in Columbus, Ohio. She wrote in her small spiral notebook, the one she kept separate from her official documentation, GS Subsidiary pattern. Check Q2, Q3. She opened the next file. Outside, Detroit was going about its evening. Two people in the same city, at the same hour, each pulling at a different end of the same thread, one without knowing the thread existed, and one without knowing where it led. The narrator's voice settles over the scene like a hand pressing gently on a table. The last thing a careful man expects is to meet someone more careful than himself. 3 weeks later, Sonia Cross knew too much to stop and not enough to report. The money moved every 47 days. Not 45, not 30, not 60. 47, irregular enough not to pattern match against standard laundering algorithms, consistent enough to be deliberate. It moved through 7 small companies in a fixed sequence, each one legitimate on its surface, collectively forming an architecture that only made sense if you followed all 7 steps at once. Most auditors would have stopped at step 2 or 3, declared the structure complex but technically defensible, and filed a clean report. Sonia had followed all 7. She'd spent the last 4 evenings alone in the office after the building cleared out, cross-referencing incorporation dates, director names, and registered addresses. What she had was not evidence of a crime, not yet. What she had was a picture of someone very intelligent building something that needed to be hidden. She knew she should report what she had. Her professional obligation was clear. But 5 years ago, she had filed an accurate, complete, professionally defensible report on a similar case, and people who deserved protection had been destroyed by how that report was used. She had spent the years since adding one rule to her process: understand the full picture before you hand it to anyone. Because a partial picture in the wrong hands was its own kind of damage. So she kept pulling. On a Tuesday evening, walking to her car in the underground garage of the Meridian Tower, where she'd been reviewing documents in Greystone's satellite office, she noticed a car's headlights flip on for 3 seconds and then go dark. The car didn't move. No one got out. She didn't stop walking. She didn't change her pace. She took her phone out as if checking a message and took a screenshot of the garage behind her through her camera. Noted the plate number, kept walking. In her car, she sat for 60 seconds before starting the engine. Could be nothing. She filed it anyway. 2 days later, her office was entered. She knew it before security confirmed it. The mark on the lock face, metal on metal, faint as a whisper, was the kind of trace a pick leaves, and she only recognized it because she'd had a locksmith explain it to her 4 years ago after a different engagement that had turned complicated in a different way. Nothing was taken, because there was nothing here to take. Her Greystone documentation existed in 4 separate locations: an encrypted cloud folder, a hardware key she wore around her neck, an offline laptop at her apartment, a sealed physical copy in a locked drawer at the law office of her attorney, Rebecca Walsh, who had instructions not to open it under any circumstances except one. Sonia sat at her desk and spent 20 minutes updating that one circumstance. She accessed the scheduling system she'd built after the incident 5 years ago, an automated email timer that required a check-in every 24 hours. If she missed the window, a pre-prepared package of documentation went to 3 recipients: Rebecca Walsh, a former colleague named David Park, who now worked in investigative journalism, and her cousin in Boston who had explicit written instructions on what to do with what she received. She reset the window from 24 hours to 24 hours. Considered. Changed it to 12. She was not afraid. She was precise. There is a difference between the two, and it matters. The next evening, walking out of Meridian Tower at 8 o'clock, she heard them before she saw them. 2 sets of footsteps in the underground parking garage, coming from 2 different directions, converging on the same point. Her point. Her hand went into her jacket pocket. Her thumb opened the recording application on her phone. She didn't run. She didn't freeze. She kept walking toward her car at the same pace, mapping the angles, counting the steps. Then a voice said one word. The voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. Stop. Both sets of footsteps stopped. Sonia turned around. The man standing 30 feet away from her was not tall in the way people describe when they want to seem impressive. He was present in the way that has nothing to do with height: medium build, early 50s, charcoal suit, silver at his temples. His hands were at his sides, relaxed, not reaching for anything. He was looking at her with the expression of someone who had assessed a situation and made a decision and was now simply executing it. The two men who had been closing in on her from opposite sides were standing completely still. Sonia looked at all three of them. Sonia. Who are you? Not thank you. Not are you okay. Who are you? The most useful question available. Marcus. Someone who needs to know what you found. Sonia. That's not an answer. That's a deflection with good sentence structure. A beat. Something shifted fractionally behind his eyes. Marcus. I'm the reason Greystone exists, which means I'm the reason you're standing in a parking garage having a difficult evening. Sonia. And if I don't tell you what I found? Marcus. Then I have a problem, and problems in my world tend to expand until they include everyone nearby. She looked at him for 3 full seconds. She looked at the two men who had stopped moving on his instruction. She looked at the way he was standing, hands open, nothing drawn, no performance of threat. The kind of man who doesn't need props. Sonia. That's the least reassuring thing anyone has said to me all week, and someone entered my office 2 days ago. Marcus. I know. It wasn't my people. Sonia. Then whose? Marcus. That's what I'm trying to find out, which is why I need to know what you found. Sonia. And you think telling you makes me safer? It wasn't a question. Marcus. I think not telling me makes you considerably less safe, and I think you're smart enough to have already run that calculation. Silence in the garage. The flickering fluorescent overhead made the shadows move in slow pulses. She had run the calculation. She ran it now, again, in real time. Sonia. I have a dead man's switch. If I don't check in within 12 hours, documentation goes to 3 separate people automatically. Marcus. I know that too. Sonia. How? Marcus. Because it's what I would have done. She studied him. Not the threat assessment kind of studying she'd been doing for the last 90 seconds. Something slightly different. The kind where you're trying to determine whether someone is telling you the truth or telling you a version of the truth that happens to be more useful to them. He was telling her the truth. She didn't know how she knew that. She filed the uncertainty. Sonia. What do you want specifically? Marcus. One conversation. Somewhere that isn't a parking garage. She thought for exactly 4 seconds. Sonia. I choose the location. Marcus. Agreed. He said it the way someone says a thing when they were already going to agree to it regardless. The office space Sonia chose was a rented conference room in a shared workspace building on Michigan Avenue. Well lit, visible from the lobby, one entrance and one exit, a coffee machine in the corner that she used before Marcus arrived. She got there 12 minutes early. She sat with her back to the window, facing the door, with her phone recording and her documentation nowhere near the room. Marcus arrived alone. He sat across from her, back to the wall, sightline to the door. They looked at each other across the table for a moment. Marcus. No water? Sonia. I wasn't sure how long this would take. He almost smiled. She wasn't sure. He began with questions, not the kind designed to intimidate, the kind designed to measure. He asked about Greystone's quarterly reporting structure, about the vendor relationships in the northern supply chain, about the payment timing patterns she'd observed in the Q3 documentation. She answered precisely, not because she trusted him, because answering accurately and efficiently was more useful than stalling. After the third question, she stopped him. Sonia. You already know what I found. You're not asking what it is. You're asking how much I understand about what it means. He held her gaze. Marcus. Yes. Sonia. Then let me save us both time. I understand enough, and I've made arrangements so that what I understand doesn't disappear if something happens to me. Marcus. I know about the arrangements. Sonia. Good. Then you know that threatening me is counterproductive. Marcus. I wasn't going to threaten you. Sonia. Then what were you going to do? Marcus. Make you an offer. He laid it out clearly. She would stay quiet about Greystone for 60 days. In that time, he would dismantle the financial structure she'd found, transfer every worker in Greystone's operation to a legitimate company within the same supply chain, and ensure that no one lost income in the transition. On day 60, she would receive a complete set of documentation that would allow her to file whatever report she chose. He said it like someone who had thought about it before walking into the room. Sonia. Why 60 days? Marcus. Because I need time to do it correctly. Sonia. That's a timeline, not a reason. Why 60 specifically and not 30 or 90? He paused. Not long. 2 seconds at most. But she caught it. Marcus. Because I'm in the middle of a transition, and things that need to close properly take time. Sonia. You're stepping down. Not a question. Marcus. What makes you say that? Sonia. Transition is the word people use when they've made a decision they don't want to fully explain. And 60 days specifically means there is a fixed event on your calendar that this needs to be resolved before. Marcus. You're good at reading gaps. Sonia. Gaps in numbers, gaps in words. Same skill, different material. This time he did smile, briefly, and it changed his face in a way she hadn't expected. They went back and forth for 20 minutes. She offered 3 counter-conditions: verification of real progress every 2 weeks with actual documents, immediate termination of the deal if any innocent parties were harmed during the process, and confirmation that her dead man's switch would remain active throughout. Marcus, you're auditing me. Sonia. I'm auditing the process. There's a difference. Marcus. What's the difference? Sonia. Auditing you means I'm judging your character. I don't have enough information to do that. Auditing the process means I'm verifying outcomes. I have enough information to do that. Marcus. Agreed. She extended her hand across the table. He shook it. Firm, brief, the handshake of someone who still considers it a meaningful gesture. They walked out separately. She took the stairs. He took the elevator. In her car on the way home, she sat at a red light on Woodward and looked at her own face in the rearview mirror. Sonia, quietly, to herself. You just made a deal with someone you know nothing about, except that everyone in that parking garage stopped moving when he spoke. Really smart. The light turned green. She drove. But here's the thing she kept coming back to. He knew about the dead man's switch. He knew about it, and he made the deal anyway. A man who wanted to control the situation would have demanded she deactivate it first. He didn't. Either he was confident enough not to need the leverage, or he actually intended to do what he said. Watch the process, not the person. That was what she was good at. She drove home and went to bed at 10:30. 2 weeks passed. The first documentation package arrived on a Tuesday morning. A folder of files sent from an address Sonia didn't recognize, but the content was unmistakably Marcus. Organized with precision, structured exactly the way an auditor would want to read it, cross-referenced across 3 formats. Whoever had put it together had thought about who was going to be reading it. She spent 4 hours going through it. Everything checked out. She sent a short confirmation from a neutral address. First checkpoint complete. Documentation consistent with stated timeline. That afternoon, Marcus was in his main conference room with Leon and 2 members of his operations team when he read it. Leon was standing near the window. He looked at the notification on Marcus's screen before Marcus put the phone face down. Leon. She's going to be a problem. Marcus. She's an auditor doing her job. That's not a problem. That's a control. Leon. A control you didn't put in place. Marcus. No, she did. I'm fine with that. Leon didn't say anything else. He moved on to the next item on his agenda. But something in his posture changed slightly, the way a room changes when someone opens a window that had been closed for a long time. Small, almost invisible. Marcus noted it the way he noted most things. Without comment, filed away. After Leon left, Marcus sat at his desk and looked at the water bottle in its usual position. He picked it up, took a sip, set it down, looked at it for a moment, returned to work. The second meeting happened because Sonia found something. Not fraud, not a new layer of the financial structure she'd been mapping. A technical gap, a procedural omission in the restructuring documents Marcus had provided that would look, to a regulator reviewing the paperwork 6 months from now, like a deliberate attempt at concealment. It wasn't. She could tell the difference, but a regulator reading a file without context might not. She wasn't obligated to tell him. Nothing in the terms of their deal required her to protect his paperwork from regulatory misinterpretation. She told him anyway, because if that gap was in her final report, it would complicate the narrative she was building. And she didn't like complicated narratives. She sent a message through the system they'd established. I need 20 minutes. You choose the location this time. He chose a coffee shop on Jefferson Avenue called The Standish. Wooden tables, no music, decent espresso. She arrived first, ordered a black coffee, and took a table near the back wall. He came alone. She noticed that immediately. No driver, no security visible in the room. She explained the gap. She had it written on a single index card, which she placed on the table between them. He read it. Asked 3 questions. Technical questions, precise ones. She answered all 3. Marcus. How long to correct it? Sonia. 2 days if you have someone who knows what they're looking at. Marcus. I have someone. He was drinking from the coffee shop's cup, not his own water bottle. She registered this the way she registered everything, without expression, filed away. And on the table beside his phone, he had a small piece of paper folded down to roughly the size of a business card. He was turning it between his fingers while he thought. Not nervous movement, more like the handling of something he'd held so many times his hands did it without instructions. When she glanced at it, he set it face down on the table. She didn't ask what it was. Grace Okafor called Marcus during that same week. She was Marcus's private physician. She had been for 7 years. She was precise, unambiguous, and constitutionally opposed to softening medical information out of misplaced kindness, which was exactly why Marcus had hired her. She called on a Wednesday afternoon. Grace, I need you to come in this week. Your last set of numbers is concerning. Marcus, I'll call you back. He didn't call back. The coffee meeting ended the way Marcus's meetings usually ended, cleanly, with the next step clear. They were gathering their things to leave. Sonia was putting the index card back in her bag. Marcus was putting on his jacket. His left hand trembled. Not badly, not a full shake. A controlled tremor that ran through his fingers for 4 or 5 seconds, enough that the third button of his jacket resisted when he tried to fasten it. He tried a second time, a third. He stopped, stood still, waited. It passed. He fastened the button. Sonia had seen it. She didn't say anything. She didn't look away. That would have been worse, a kind of performance of not noticing that anyone with eyes could see through. She didn't stare either. She just continued putting her things away at the same pace she had been going, as if the moment had not happened. He realized she'd seen it, and he realized she had made a deliberate choice about what to do with what she'd seen. Everyone who had ever witnessed that tremor either overdid the pretending not to notice or reacted in a way that required him to manage their discomfort. She did neither. She just kept moving, calm and even, as though it was not her business to react to something he hadn't offered for reaction. They walked out of the Standish and parted on the sidewalk. Standard goodbye. Nothing more. On the drive back, Marcus realized that for the first time in 8 months, he had not kept his left hand in his jacket pocket through an entire meeting. He sat with that for a while. Week 4. A man named Gregory Holt arrived at Sonia's office without an appointment. He said he was an attorney representing a coalition of Greystone industrial shareholders. He was impeccably dressed and spoke with the careful precision of someone accustomed to delivering proposals that could not be easily refused. His proposal: file her audit findings immediately, within 7 days, in exchange for double her standard engagement fee. Sonia listened through to the end. Sonia. Who told you I was working on a Greystone audit? Holt. That information is confidential. Sonia. Who told you I had found something worth expediting? There was a pause behind his eyes. Brief, but she caught it. Holt. That's also. Sonia. Confidential. I understand. The answer is no. Not for twice the fee, not for 3 times. The work isn't complete and I don't file incomplete work. He left a business card on her desk and thanked her for her time. After the door closed, she sat very still for a moment. Then she wrote in her notebook. Who knew about this deal? Marcus. And whoever Marcus told. Or whoever was told by whoever Marcus told. Marcus called her at 2:15 that afternoon, before she had a chance to contact him. Sonia. You already know. Marcus. You were approached this morning. Sonia. Yes. Marcus. By an attorney claiming to represent Greystone shareholders. Sonia. Yes. A pause on the line. Sonia. You're watching me. Marcus. I'm watching everyone with access to information about this situation. It's not the same thing. Sonia. It feels the same from here. Marcus. I understand that. Did you accept? Sonia. No. Marcus. Good. Sonia. Did you know they were going to approach me? The pause before his answer was short. 1 second, maybe slightly less. But she caught it the same way she'd caught the pause in Gregory Holt's eyes. Marcus. No. Which means someone told them. And the only people who knew about our arrangement. Sonia. Are you and whoever you told? Marcus. I didn't tell anyone. She heard it. Plain. Simple. The kind of sentence that doesn't have anything underneath it. Sonia. But someone told them. Marcus. Yes. Sonia. Someone close. Marcus. Yes. She didn't ask who. She had enough to understand the shape of the problem. Marcus did not confront Leon directly. He had learned, across 20 years of making decisions that other people would have made in 3 minutes and that he made in 3 days, that suspicion without evidence is just an emotion with ambition. And decisions made from emotion alone had already cost him more than he was prepared to think about right now. He created a piece of false information, a company name, he called it Northgate Holdings, that would supposedly absorb a portion of Greystone's transitioning assets. He put the name in a briefing document that he shared exclusively with Leon during a one-on-one meeting on a Thursday afternoon. Then he waited 48 hours. At 9:17 on Saturday morning, his phone showed an email from the same law firm that had sent Gregory Holt to Sonia's office. The email referenced Northgate Holdings and inquired about potential acquisition opportunities. Marcus sat in his home office and read the email twice. He didn't call anyone. He didn't stand up. He didn't put his fist through the wall, which was something a younger version of himself might have considered. He sat very still with the knowledge of it. 20 years of trust, and the specific weight of what it feels like when trust becomes past tense. After a while, he set the phone down. He called Sonia that evening. Not about the test, not yet. He needed to think through what came next before he moved. They talked through the situation in broad terms, the approach she'd received, the implications for her security, whether the dead man's switch needed updating. At the end of the conversation, after the operational part was done, there was a silence. Not uncomfortable, just the kind that settles when two people have finished what they came to say and haven't quite decided to leave yet. Sonia. Marcus. Her first time using his name without his last name attached. He noticed. Marcus. Yes. Sonia. Are you okay? 3 words. Simple. Without agenda, without strategy, without the performance of concern that people who wanted something from him sometimes deployed. She asked it the way someone asks when they actually want to know the answer. The last time anyone had asked him that question, and genuinely meant it was a long time ago, long enough that the memory of it felt like something from a different person's life. He sat with the question for a full 3 seconds. Marcus. Call me if they approach you again. He ended the call. He set the phone on the desk, looked at the water bottle in its usual corner, looked at his left hand. "Are you okay?" The last person who had asked him that and wanted the real answer was a woman named Diane. 15 years ago, on a night he could still see clearly if he let himself, which he generally did not. He generally did not. Grace Okafor was not a person given to intuition. She trusted data, peer-reviewed literature, and the kind of pattern recognition that only comes from 18 years of clinical practice. She did not trust gut feelings. She trusted what gut feelings were pointing at when she was willing to follow them to their actual source. The gut feeling that had been troubling her for 3 weeks was pointing at Marcus's progression charts. She printed all 8 months and laid them side by side on the examination table in her private office one evening after her last appointment. She stood at the end of the table and looked at the full picture. The trajectory was wrong. In the literature on Marcus's specific neurological condition, early-stage progression followed a consistent and documented curve. Slow initial advancement, gradual acceleration, predictable enough that timelines could be estimated within a reasonable margin. It was not a gentle disease, but it was a consistent one. Marcus's chart showed a sharp acceleration in month 3. Then, in month 4, a plateau, not a natural leveling, but a distinct pause, as though something had been recalibrated. Then months 5 through 8 advancing faster than any baseline she'd read. Natural disease doesn't recalibrate. Natural disease doesn't pause and restart. She stood at that table for a long time. Then she went to Marcus's office building after hours, used the access key he had given her years ago for medical emergencies, and collected a sample from his private water bottle. She labeled it under a false patient name. She sent it to an independent lab in Cleveland that she had used twice before for sensitive cases. She did not tell Marcus, not yet, not until she knew what she was looking at. The results came back in 5 days. She read them in her car in the hospital parking lot because she didn't want to be sitting at her desk when she did. Trace presence of a synthetic neurological compound. Research grade. Not commercially available. The kind of substance that existed in specialized lab catalogs and institutional research environments. It was not present in quantities that would cause acute harm. It was present in quantities that, accumulated over 6 to 8 months of daily exposure, would produce exactly the kind of accelerated progression she had been seeing in Marcus's charts. Someone with advanced medical knowledge, or direct access to it, had been putting this into his water supply. She sat in her car for a long time. Then she drove to Marcus's building. She put the lab results on his desk without a word. Just placed the 2 pages in front of him and sat down across from him and waited. He read them. He read them the way Marcus read everything. Without rushing, without visible reaction, taking in each line fully before moving to the next. When he finished, he set the pages down and looked out the window. The city was in its late afternoon light, all long shadows and orange glass. A full minute passed without either of them speaking. Marcus. How long? Not how long did he have. How long had this been happening? Grace. Based on the concentration levels, 6 to 8 months, possibly longer. The compound accumulates, so early exposures may have been at smaller doses. Marcus. You said it would require someone with medical knowledge. Grace. Advanced medical knowledge, or direct access to someone who has it. He looked at his left hand. The tremor was present, small and steady. He placed his right hand over it, not hiding. She could see the difference now. Holding, just holding himself in place. Marcus. Can it be reversed? Grace. The compound, yes. Now that we know what it is, we can clear it. Your underlying condition, that's more complicated. But without the compound accelerating it, the rate of progression should slow significantly, more than I originally projected. Marcus. Define significantly. Grace. Years instead of months, potentially, if you take care of yourself going forward. He absorbed that, said nothing for a long time. Grace. Marcus. Whoever did this, they didn't just affect your health. They took the information that would have told you to stop and get aggressive treatment earlier. They took that choice from you. Marcus. I know. Grace. What are you going to do? Marcus. Start treatment. Quietly. Can you manage that without routing it through the main system? Grace. Yes. Marcus. Then we start this week. And Grace, thank you for following it. She left. Marcus sat alone in his office after she went. He looked at the water bottle in the corner of his desk, the one that had been there every morning for 20 years, placed by the same pair of hands, in the same position, without Marcus ever once thinking to question it. He stood up, walked to the desk, picked up the water bottle and moved it to the floor near the far wall, away from arm's reach. He didn't throw it. He didn't break it. He set it down quietly, the way you put away something you've been carrying for too long without realizing it. Then he reached into his inside jacket pocket and took out the folded paper. He had carried it for 15 years. A piece of plain white notepaper, folded many times, the edges worn smooth from handling. He opened it slowly. The handwriting was faded, but still legible. Blue ink. An address that was no longer current, and below it, a single sentence. Call me when you're ready. The initial at the bottom was D. He stood at his window with the paper open in both hands. Marcus, quietly. Who has been at my side for 20 years? Who knows my schedule, my space, my water? Who would lose the most when I step down? He paused. Marcus. Who told me she was dead? He folded the paper back along its old creases, pressed it flat between his palms for a moment, put it back in his pocket. Leon Ashby was not a stupid man. That was the most important thing to understand about him. He recognized the false information about Northgate Holdings because he had spent 20 years learning how Marcus thought. He had watched Marcus run exactly this kind of verification test on a dozen other people, plant a specific, traceable piece of information, and then wait to see where it surfaced. He had helped design some of those tests. He had always been on the other side of them. Until now. He sat in his office on a Friday evening after the building had emptied, and he understood with complete clarity that Marcus knew. Not everything, perhaps, but enough to test. And the test had been run, and the test had been answered. He felt something that he did not have an easy word for. It was not fear. It was not the practical animal response of someone preparing to flee or fight. It was closer to grief. The specific kind that arrives when something you always knew was fragile finally breaks, and you have to acknowledge that you knew it was fragile all along. He thought about what he had done and did not, in the silence of his office, try to justify it. He thought instead about what came next. Marcus was moving toward a confrontation. That was inevitable now. And while Leon could not stop it, he could delay it. He could create a problem that required Marcus's immediate attention, something external that would pull his focus before he was ready to have the conversation Leon could see coming. The problem he chose was Sonia Cross. He contacted Gregory Holt's firm, not to buy her silence anymore, to increase the pressure on her until she either filed early or created a disruption that Marcus would have to address. He made the call. He was calm while he made it. He was not calm after. 3 days later, at 7:40 in the evening, Sonia called Marcus. Sonia. The situation has changed, Marcus. How? Sonia. I've had a car following me every day for 3 days. Not covertly. They want me to know it's there. Our deal assumed I would remain safe. I'm not. Marcus. When did this start? Sonia. 3 days ago. Same car, different drivers. Marcus. Where are you right now? Sonia. Why does it matter? Marcus. Because I'm coming to get you. And I'd like to know which direction to drive before I leave the building. A pause on her end. Sonia. Monroe Street, the coffee shop with the green door. Marcus. 20 minutes. He was there in 18. The safe apartment was on the 4th floor of a building in Midtown that Marcus kept for exactly these purposes. Clean, functional, no personal marks of anyone, the kind of space that existed to be used and then forgotten. It was past 11 when they got there. They sat at the small kitchen table. Sonia had found tea in the cabinet. Marcus made coffee from the machine on the counter. They went through the operational specifics first. Short-term security measures, updated check-in protocols for her dead man's switch, a temporary modification to her daily movement patterns. Professional, efficient, the kind of conversation that had a clear beginning and end. After it ended, there was a silence. Marcus was reviewing a detail on his phone, one last item, and in the middle of it, his left hand, resting on the table, trembled. His cup tapped the surface lightly, not spilling, just enough to be heard. He looked at his own hand, not covering it this time, just looking at it. Sonia, how long have you had that? He looked up. She was watching him with the same quality of attention she gave to everything. Direct, without judgment, simply present. Marcus. 8 months. Officially. Unofficially. He stopped. Sonia. Unofficially longer. Marcus. Unofficially, I think someone helped it along. He heard himself say it. He hadn't decided to say it. He had been not saying it for 8 months, to everyone, in every situation, with complete consistency. But it was past 11 in a small kitchen he had no personal attachment to, and there was no remaining reason that felt sufficient for continued pretending. Sonia. Have you confirmed it? Marcus. Yesterday. Sonia. Who? Marcus. I don't know for certain yet. He paused. I have a suspicion I don't want to have. Sonia. The hardest evidence to accept is the evidence that proves someone you trusted. Marcus. Yes. Exactly that. A quiet settled between them. Outside the window, Detroit at midnight was doing what cities do. Never fully sleeping, never fully waking. Sonia. Can I tell you something? Marcus. Yes. Sonia. 5 years ago, I filed a report on a situation not entirely unlike this one. Everything in the report was accurate. Every number, every finding. I did the work correctly. Marcus. What happened? Sonia. The authority that acted on it moved too fast and too broadly. People lost jobs who had done nothing wrong. Not because I made an error, because I hadn't thought far enough past the accuracy of the information to how it would be used. Marcus. What did you do with that? Sonia. I rebuilt everything. Added a consequence review step to every engagement. Started asking my clients how they intended to use my findings before I delivered them. Made the work slower and harder. She looked at her cup. I still think about those people. Marcus. You could have just changed firms, or changed your process quietly without telling anyone. Sonia. Yes, but that would have been the easier version of better. I needed the harder version. He looked at her for a moment. Marcus. That's the most useful thing anyone has said to me in 15 years. Before they separated for the night, Marcus reached into his jacket pocket and placed the folded paper on the table between them. He didn't open it. He just set it there. Marcus. There's something from 15 years ago that I believe is connected to what's happening now. I'm not ready to tell you everything yet, but I want you to know it exists. Sonia looked at the paper. She didn't reach for it. Sonia. Okay. Marcus. Okay. Sonia. When you're ready. I'm not going anywhere tonight anyway. It was close to 1 in the morning. The tea was long finished. The coffee was gone. They were sitting at the kitchen table with empty cups and the kind of quiet that doesn't require filling. Marcus was looking out the window. Not at anything specific, just out. And in the kitchen light, he looked different than he looked in his office or the conference rooms or the places where he was always the center around which everything else organized itself. He looked like a 48-year-old man who had been carrying a very heavy thing for a very long time, alone, in the dark, without anyone to set it down in front of. Sonia had been watching him for a moment without speaking, and then she stood up. She walked to where he was sitting. She put one hand on the table beside him, and she leaned down, and she kissed him. It was not impulsive. It was not the act of someone swept away by circumstance. It was deliberate and clear. The act of a woman who had seen this man fully over the course of 7 weeks, who had watched him hide his trembling hand and keep his pills in his pocket and carry a piece of paper for 15 years, and never once ask anyone else to help him carry it, and who had decided that standing at a distance was no longer something she was willing to do. I see you, all of you. That is what the kiss said, in the only language available for saying it. Marcus went still. 1 second. 2. Then he responded. And in that response was something that had been closed for a very long time. When they separated, the room was quiet. And then, in a low voice, not a declaration, but a sentence that escaped from the deepest part of a man who had never learned a gentler vocabulary, Marcus said, "Marcus, now you belong to me." Sonia looked at him. She was not angry. She was not afraid. She was calm in the way of someone who recognizes a language she has heard before, the language of control attempting to name something it doesn't have words for. Sonia. Nobody belongs to anybody, Marcus. He held her gaze. Sonia. But I can choose to stay. Something in him shifted. The specific shift of a thing that has been held rigid far past its natural tolerance. Not a collapse. The opening of something. Quiet, irreversible, and a long time coming. He sat back down. She returned to her chair. Neither of them spoke for a while, but neither of them left. The morning after, they were both at the kitchen table working. Marcus had documents spread across one end. Sonia had her laptop and a printed copy of the latest Greystone materials. 2 weeks remained until the 60-day deadline. It was an ordinary morning, in the specific way that mornings in unusual circumstances manage to seem ordinary because the people in them need them to be. Marcus was flipping through a paper folder when a loose page fell out. Sonia, seated nearby, reached down to pick it up. Before handing it back, she looked. It was a photograph, printed on plain white paper, not professional quality. A woman photographed from a distance. She was sitting near a window, looking out, unaware of the camera. The image had the quality of something taken carefully, from far enough away not to be noticed. Sonia held it and looked at it. The face, the particular angle of the jaw, the way the woman held her shoulders. 3 years ago, Portland, Oregon. An audit engagement for a small medical device manufacturer called Pacific Coast MedSource. The bookkeeper there had been a quiet woman who kept meticulous records and spoke in meetings only when she had something precise to contribute. Her name in the employment files had been Helen Marsh. Sonia. Who is this? Marcus looked up from his laptop. He looked at the photograph. Then he looked at her. Something moved behind his eyes. The look of someone who has just stepped into a room they didn't expect to enter today. Marcus. Someone I knew a long time ago. Sonia. Is she still alive? Marcus. No. Sonia. Are you certain? Not how did she die. Not what happened to her. Are you certain? He stopped completely. Marcus. Why are you asking it that way? Sonia. Because I've seen this person. She told him what she remembered. 3 years ago, Portland, the name of the engagement, the name of the company, the woman who worked in the accounting department under the name Helen Marsh. They had interacted 4 or 5 times over 3 weeks, brief professional exchanges, nothing that would stand out in the normal record of a working audit engagement. But she had noted the woman as a behavioral anomaly in her private log, the notebook she kept separate from her official documentation because of one specific pattern. Every time anyone in a meeting mentioned Detroit, the city, the weather, a news story, anything, the woman redirected the conversation immediately, smoothly, without drawing attention, but consistently. Enough times that it registered as a pattern rather than coincidence. Sonia. She's alive. Or she was 3 years ago. I can't tell you where she is now. Marcus was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was even. Careful. Marcus. Leon told me she died in a car accident in New Mexico, about 12 years after she left. He had documentation. Sonia. Documentation can be arranged. Marcus. I know that. A pause. A long one. I knew that then too, but I didn't want to look. Sonia. Why? He looked at the folded paper that had materialized in his hand without his noticing. The reflexive reach. The one his hands made without instruction after 15 years. Marcus. Because if I looked and found out she was alive, I would have had to ask why she left, and I wasn't ready for the answer to that. Sonia let that sit without filling it. Marcus. Her name was Diane. We were together for 3 years. She left without explanation. I searched for 3 years, and then Leon told me she had died in an accident and I stopped. He set the folded paper on the table, looked at it. Marcus. I stopped because it was easier than not stopping, and because the person who told me she was dead was the person I trusted most. He called Leon at 10:30 that morning. Come to the apartment on 4th. An address Leon knew, one of several properties Marcus maintained. No reason given, just an address and a time. Leon arrived at 11:15. He came alone. He looked the way Leon always looked, composed, measured, the face of a man who knew how to hold himself in environments of uncertainty. He had been doing it for 20 years. They sat across from each other at the kitchen table. Sonia was in the other room. Marcus had placed the lab results. Grace's 2 pages, the ones that named the compound and traced its chemical class, on the table between them. Leon looked at the pages. 1 second. 2. Marcus. Diane is alive. The sentence cut through everything. Leon didn't speak. Marcus. She was alive 3 years ago. Probably still is. You told me she died in a car accident in New Mexico. You had documentation. And for the past 8 months you've been putting something in my water that has been accelerating my condition. He spoke without anger. Not because he wasn't feeling anything, but because he had made a decision before Leon arrived that this conversation would be conducted in facts. Emotions were his. The facts were for both of them. Marcus. I'm not asking whether you did these things. I know you did. I'm asking you to tell me why. Leon sat with that question for a long moment. Then he began to speak. About Diane, 15 years ago. He had watched Marcus preparing to give everything up for her. Not step down, leave, disappear into a different life entirely. And Leon had gone to Diane privately and told her something that was, he said, partly true. That in the world Marcus occupied, the people closest to him became the most vulnerable. That her presence would always be a liability for him and for herself. Leon. She believed me, because I was telling her a truth. I omitted the other truth. That you were capable of changing the situation. That you would have found a way to make it safe. I didn't give you the chance to try. Marcus. You decided for me. Leon. Yes, Marcus. And then when I spent 3 years looking for her, you told me she was dead. Leon. I told you what would let you stop looking. What would let you move forward. Marcus. Forward into what? Leon. Into this. Into what you built. Into everything we built. The silence in the room had weight. Marcus. And the compound. Leon. I found out about your condition 8 months ago. I found your medical file. He stopped, started again. I watched you beginning to arrange the transition, choosing the people who would take over, and I understood that when you were done, there would be no place for me in what came next. Marcus. So you made me sicker. Leon. I made the illness move at a speed that would keep things as they were. I never wanted to hurt you. I never intended. Marcus. You put something in my water every day for 8 months. Whatever you intended. That is what you did. Leon looked at his hands on the table. He didn't defend himself. He didn't explain further. He was, underneath all of it, a man who knew exactly what he had done. Leon. I'm sorry. I know that doesn't. I know what it's worth right now. But I need to say it. Marcus, I know you are. He looked at Leon for a long time. The man who had been beside him for 20 years. The man who had carried things for him, managed things for him, made the 100 invisible decisions that kept the machinery of their shared life running. The man who had, in the name of something he called loyalty, taken 15 years away from him and then tried to take the years he had left. Marcus. Leave. Leon. Marcus. Marcus. Leon. Just the name. No volume. No performance. A door being closed for the last time. Leave. Leon stood. He walked to the door. He stopped with his hand on the handle. Leon. I'm sorry. Marcus. I know you are. That doesn't change anything. The door opened. The door closed. The apartment was quiet. Sonia came out of the other room after a moment. She didn't say anything. She put the kettle on. Marcus was sitting at the table with the folded paper in both hands, not moving. After a while, the kettle clicked off. She made 2 cups of tea. She'd found the tea bags yesterday, knew he didn't drink tea, made him one anyway. She set one in front of him and sat down. He looked at it. Marcus. She was in Portland 3 years ago. Sonia. Yes. Marcus. And she's probably still somewhere in Oregon. Sonia. That would be my guess. He looked at the folded paper, at the address on it that was 15 years old. Marcus. I didn't look. For 12 years after he told me she was dead, I didn't look. Because it was easier not to. Sonia. Yes. Marcus. That's the part that's hardest to sit with. Not what he did. What I allowed to be done by not asking questions I should have asked. Sonia didn't offer a contradiction. There wasn't one available. Marcus. What do you do with that? Sonia. You sit with it until you can move inside of it. That's the only thing there is. He looked at her. Then he looked at the tea. He picked it up and drank some. 3 days later, Marcus met with his attorney. Her name was Caroline Reed. She had represented Marcus's legitimate interests for 11 years, and she was one of approximately 4 people on Earth who knew the full scope of what Marcus Vale's business operations actually comprised. He put Grace's lab results on her desk, along with a documented account of the compound's introduction into his water supply, the chain of circumstantial evidence linking it to Leon, and Leon's verbal confession, recorded with Leon's knowledge, on a device Marcus had been carrying since the morning he called Leon to the apartment. He also put on her desk a complete filing package for the Greystone situation, per the terms of the deal he'd made with Sonia, ready for independent submission. Caroline read everything. She had a quality Marcus had always valued in her. She read without reacting, processing information in full before forming a response. Caroline. You understand that filing this formally will open other lines of inquiry. Marcus. Yes. Caroline. Some of those lines will not be comfortable. Marcus. I understand that. Caroline. There are other ways to handle the Leon situation, ways that would be less visible. Marcus. I know. I don't want those ways. Caroline. Why? Marcus. Because he believed that what he was doing didn't have real consequences, that the world he operated in was separate from the world where actions are measured against their actual cost. He paused. The only honest response to that belief is to put him in a world where consequences are exactly as real as they are everywhere else. Caroline. That's going to be perceived as a weakness by some people in your world, Marcus. Yes, I'm at peace with that. He had thought about it for 3 days. He was. Caroline filed the materials through official channels by the end of the week. Marcus signed everything. His full name, not an intermediary. Grace began the treatment protocol the following Monday. She explained it with her usual directness. The compound could be cleared from his system over 3 to 4 weeks with a specific detoxification regimen. His underlying condition would continue to exist and progress, but at its natural rate, which, in his case, given the early stage at diagnosis, was significantly slower than what had been artificially produced. Grace. Without the compound, the progression should stabilize within 90 days. I'm projecting years of functional stability, not permanent remission, but years. Marcus. Define functional. Grace. You'll need to manage certain activities differently. You'll need to be consistent about treatment. But you can continue working. You can travel. You can live your life. He absorbed this. Marcus. Can I drive to Oregon? Grace looked at him. She was a precise woman, and she understood precise questions. Grace. Yes, Marcus. You can drive to Oregon. He wrote the letter that evening. Plain white paper, blue pen. He wrote 3 drafts and threw them away before he wrote the 4th one and kept it. It said, I know you are alive. I know now what I did not know then, that you did not leave on your own, and that you were told things that were not true. I know who told you those things. That person is no longer part of my life. I am not writing to ask for anything. You do not owe me a reply. You do not owe me an explanation or forgiveness. None of it. But you deserve to know that I know the truth, and that for 15 years I lived inside a story that was designed to keep both of us from asking questions. If you ever want to talk, I will be here. He signed it M, not his full name, just the initial she had used. He sealed it and gave it to Caroline to send through an address-verified forwarding service to the most recent location he'd been able to confirm through private inquiry. A town in southern Oregon, a name she no longer used. He put the folded paper back in his pocket. The old address still visible, the old handwriting still there. He would need to update it eventually, but not tonight. The Greystone deal closed on day 60. Sonia called at 9 in the morning. Sonia. The materials are in order. Our deal is complete. Marcus. Yes. Sonia. I'm keeping the documentation. Marcus. I know. Sonia. That means this could still go somewhere down the line, if circumstances change. Marcus. I know that too. Sonia. You're okay with that. Marcus. A deal is a deal. You held your side. I held mine. What you do with the information after is yours. A brief quiet on the line. Sonia. Marcus, the workers, the way you closed it, it didn't have to go that way. Marcus. No. But it should have. That evening, Sonia came to the apartment to collect the last set of physical materials she'd kept there during the final weeks of the engagement. The apartment would go back to being an ordinary address after tonight. They were at the kitchen table one last time. She had tea, he had coffee. The operational portion of their relationship was, as of 9 that morning, formally concluded. Sonia. What are you going to do next? Marcus. With what? Sonia. With everything. He thought about it. Marcus. Continue the transition. The things that Leon was supposed to manage, the parts that were legitimate, I'm distributing across 3 people who are better suited to them anyway. The rest will close over the next 6 months. A pause. And I'm going to Oregon at some point, if she's willing. Sonia. And if she's not? Marcus. Then she's not. I sent a letter. The decision is hers. Sonia. That's the right answer. Marcus. I know. It still feels wrong in the way that right answers sometimes do. She smiled at that. Not a large smile, just an acknowledgement. Marcus. Can I ask you something? Sonia. Yes. Marcus. You said you rebuilt your process after the incident 5 years ago. You added steps, made the work harder. You still think about the people who were hurt. Sonia. Yes. Marcus. Does it get easier? Sonia. It gets further away, and at the same time it stays exactly as clear. Both things at once, indefinitely. She looked at her cup. I stopped expecting it to resolve completely. Once I stopped expecting that, it became easier to live with. Marcus. How long did it take to stop expecting it? Sonia. About 3 years. Marcus. That's a long time. Sonia. It's a reasonable amount of time for something that actually happened. He looked at her. Marcus. What you said that night, nobody belongs to anybody. Sonia. Yes. Marcus. I've thought about that every day since. Sonia. What have you thought about it? Marcus. That I spent 20 years running an organization built on people being where I needed them, doing what I needed them to do. And I called that loyalty, and I believed it was mutual. Sonia. Some of it was. Marcus. Some of it was. And some of it was Leon. He paused. And I think some of it was me. Not understanding the difference between someone being loyal because they choose to be and someone being loyal because they don't see another option. Sonia didn't correct him. She let it sit. Marcus. The thing you said about choosing to stay, that was… He stopped. She waited. Marcus. That was the most important thing anyone has said to me in a very long time. She looked at him quietly for a moment. Sonia. You should tell her that, Diane. Not those exact words, but the idea behind them. That you understand now the difference between someone staying because they're held there and someone staying because they want to. Marcus. I put something like that in the letter. Sonia. Good. 6 weeks later. Marcus was in his office at 11:47 at night. The building was empty except for the overnight security team on the ground floor. He had been working since 7, the kind of work that belongs to the transition period of a thing, the administrative dismantling of structures that took years to build, and that have to come down carefully if they're going to come down without damaging what's around them. His desk was cleaner than it had been in years. Less paper, more space. His phone rang. Unknown number, area code 503. He looked at it through 2 full rings. He answered. Marcus. Yes. A pause on the line. And then a voice he had not heard in 15 years. He listened. He didn't move. He didn't reach for a pen or a piece of paper. He just listened, his left hand open on the desk, the city silent outside the window. Marcus. I know. I should have looked harder. He listened again, longer this time. Marcus. No, I'm not angry. Not at you. A pause. I understand why you believed him. I would have believed him too. More listening. His face changed as the conversation went on, not dramatically, not in the way of someone coming apart, more like the gradual movement of something that had been frozen for a long time, the specific slow thaw that comes when pressure is finally released from a direction it didn't expect. Marcus. I'm not here to take anything back. Wherever you are, whatever you've built, that's yours. All of it. He listened for a long time. Marcus. Whenever you're ready, no rush, no timeline, whenever. A quiet moment. Marcus. Yes. He ended the call. He set the phone on the desk. His left hand was still open in front of him. The tremor was there, small, persistent, something that would likely be part of his days going forward regardless of how well the treatment progressed. He looked at it. He did not cover it with his right hand. He just looked at it, the way you look at something you have finally decided to stop hiding. A hand doing the best it can with what it has. That was all. That was enough. 2 days later, Sonia was at her desk when her personal phone vibrated. An email. She recognized the address immediately. The body of the email was a financial report, a quarterly statement for a mid-sized manufacturing company in Wisconsin that she had never heard of. There was no introduction, no explanation, just the document, and one line at the bottom. Thought you might find the Q4 numbers interesting. MV. She read the report. She narrowed her eyes the way she did when she saw something. She made a note in her notebook. She opened her laptop. She spent the next 2 hours on it. She sent a reply at 4:15 in the afternoon. The Q4 numbers are not the interesting part. Look at Q3, line 7, and the footnote on page 4. His response came 40 minutes later. I see it. Her response, I know you do. His response, after another 30 minutes, I have two more like this, if you're interested. She looked at her screen for a moment. She looked at the notebook on her desk, the one she kept separate from her official files, the one that had Greystone written at the top of a page that was now closed. She opened a new page. Sonia, send them when you're ready. 1 week after that, Marcus went to Grace's clinic for his monthly appointment. He arrived on time. He had never arrived on time before. There had always been a reason to reschedule, a meeting that ran long, a situation that required attention. Grace had, over 7 years, learned to factor in a 40% chance of cancellation when scheduling Marcus. He was in the waiting room at 2:58 for a 3 o'clock appointment. He had the folded paper in his hands, turning it between his fingers in the old habit. But this time, waiting, he opened it. The address was still there. The handwriting still faded blue. The line, call me when you're ready. Beside the old address, he had written a new phone number in the margin. Oregon area code. He had written it carefully, in the same blue ink, as if matching it to the original mattered. He folded the paper closed. He didn't put it back in his jacket pocket this time. He opened his wallet, the one he had carried for 12 years, worn at the corners, the interior divided into the small categories that organize a life, and he placed the folded paper inside it. In the section behind his driver's license, where the things that are real are kept close. Grace came to the waiting room door. Grace, you're on time. Marcus. I'm trying something new. She almost smiled at that. Almost. 3 weeks after that, on a clear October morning, Marcus drove west out of Detroit on I-94. He had told no one where he was going except Grace, who had confirmed that the drive was medically reasonable, and Caroline Reed, who had an address to work from and instructions in case anything required urgent attention during his absence. He drove alone. He drove through Indiana and Illinois and into Iowa, and he stopped for the night in a small town in Nebraska that he chose entirely because there was a diner visible from the highway exit and he was hungry. He ate a club sandwich at the counter and talked briefly with the woman who brought his coffee. She asked where he was headed, and he said Oregon, and she said that's a long drive, and he said yes it is, and she refilled his cup without being asked. He drove through Wyoming on the second day. The mountains came up slowly, the landscape expanding in the way that American landscapes do when you leave the Midwest. Suddenly there is more sky than land, and the land that is there is older looking, as if it has been doing its work longer and without complaint. He thought about Diane while he drove, not about the conversation they'd had, the careful things they'd both said on that first phone call, the agreements that had been made about time and pace and no expectations. He thought about who she had been, who they had both been, before any of this. He thought about the 3 years they had spent together when he was 31 and she was 32, and the world was considerably smaller than it had since become. He thought about the 15 years in between, not with anger, with the particular honesty that long drives in large landscapes tend to produce, where things that were kept small by proximity have room to be their actual size. He was not a man who had handled this well. He had accepted a lie because not accepting it required courage he hadn't been willing to find. He had built walls and called them strength. He had let a man he trusted too absolutely make decisions that were not Leon's to make, and he had let it happen because it was easier to not see what Leon was doing than to see it and deal with it. He could not change those 15 years. He was not going to carry them into the next ones. He drove into Oregon on the third afternoon, down through the Cascades, the air changing to something cooler and green-smelling, the highway following a river for 60 miles before opening into the Rogue Valley. He stopped at a gas station and bought a cup of coffee and stood outside in the light for a moment. Then he drove the last 40 minutes to a small town called Ashland, in the foothills south of Medford, where the streets were narrow and tree-lined, and there was a Shakespeare festival, and where a woman who had been living quietly under the name Helen Marsh for 12 years had agreed, in a phone call 6 weeks ago to meet him for coffee at a cafe on Main Street at 2 in the afternoon on a Saturday in October. He parked 2 blocks away. He walked slowly. He was 10 minutes early. He sat at a table outside and ordered coffee and watched the street. At 2 o'clock exactly, she came around the corner. She looked older, which was true of both of them. Her hair was darker than he remembered, with gray at the temples. She walked the same way she always had, carefully, with attention. She saw him from the end of the block. She stopped for a moment. He stood up from the table. They looked at each other from 40 feet away, across 15 years, and all the distances contained within them. Then she started walking again. He waited. She sat down across from him. She looked at him directly, which he had always admired about her, the particular quality of her attention. Diane. You look the same. Marcus. You look the same. They both knew neither of those things was entirely true, but they were both true enough. Diane. I'm glad you wrote the letter the way you wrote it. Marcus. Which part? Diane. The part where you didn't ask for anything. Marcus. I have enough things. I don't need to ask for anything. She looked at him for a moment. Then she looked at her hands on the table. Diane. I believed him because he was telling me a version of the truth. It's taken me a long time to stop being angry at myself for that. Marcus. He was very good at versions of the truth. Diane. Yes, he was. Marcus. The mistake wasn't that you believed him. The mistake was that I let the situation be one where he could get to you without me knowing. She looked up. Diane. You couldn't have known. Marcus. I could have looked harder. When you left, I should have found you regardless of what he told me. Diane. You looked for 3 years. Marcus. I should have looked until I found you. A silence settled between them. The street around them continued. People walking past, someone's dog pulling at a leash, the sound of a door opening and closing somewhere. Diane. What do you want from this? Honestly. He thought about it honestly. Marcus. I want to know how you are. I want to know what you've built here. He paused. I want to stop having to grieve someone who is sitting 40 feet away. She absorbed that. Diane. And after that? Marcus. After that? I don't know. I'm not here to make demands. I'm not here to be owed anything. I'm here because I needed to sit across from you at least once and know that you're real. She was quiet for a moment. Diane. I'm real. Marcus. I know. The coffee arrived. They drank it. They talked for 2 hours. About where their lives had gone. The parallel decades that had unfolded without intersection. She had built something here. A small house. Work she was good at. A life that was quieter than the one she had left, and that fit her in ways the other one hadn't. She told him about these things without apology or defensiveness, and he listened without performing acceptance, and both of those things were, he recognized, harder than they looked. When they finished, they stood on the sidewalk in the late afternoon light. Diane. I'm not ready for a lot, whatever this is. Marcus. I know, Diane, but I'm not ready for something. Marcus. That's enough. That's more than enough. She looked at him one more time, that same direct quality, unchanged. Diane. Drive safe going back. Marcus. I will. She walked down the street, turned the corner, was gone. He stood on the sidewalk for a moment. Then he walked back to his car. He sat in the driver's seat and took out his wallet, took out the folded paper, opened it to where the phone number was written. The Oregon number, the new one, in blue ink beside the old address. He looked at it for a moment. Then he folded the paper closed and put it back in his wallet, in the section behind his driver's license, where the things that are real are kept. He started the car. A man who controls an entire city learns 2 things early. First, what other people are afraid of. Second, how to make sure they never find out what he is afraid of. What he learns later, if he's fortunate, If the right person sits across from him at a kitchen table at 11 in the evening and says something true enough to cut through 20 years of practice, is that the second skill is not strength. It is the thing that looks like strength from the outside and hollows out everything from the inside. It is the architecture of a life built around a wall, and the wall is load-bearing only until it isn't, and by then you have lived inside it for so long you've forgotten what the outside looks like. Marcus Vale drove back through Oregon with the windows down. He thought about what Sonia had said. The story you told yourself to survive turned out to be wrong. You tell a different story. You give yourself time to believe it. There is no shortcut. He thought about Grace, who had followed something she was afraid to find because not following it would have been a betrayal of what she knew to be her job. He thought about Leon, not with anger anymore, or not only with anger, with something more complicated. The specific sadness of watching someone love in a way that guarantees they will destroy the thing they love, and knowing that they couldn't see it, and knowing that you couldn't see it either until it was done. He thought about Diane, sitting across from him on a sidewalk in a small town in Oregon, looking exactly like herself. He thought about a woman named Sonia Cross, who had found a gap in a financial ledger 8 weeks ago and had been the wrong kind of thorough about it, and who had kissed him in a kitchen at 1 in the morning, not because she needed something from him, but because she had decided to stop standing at a distance, and who had said nobody belongs to anybody, and who had meant it in a way that had changed the entire shape of what he understood loyalty to be. He drove. The mountains went past. The river ran alongside the highway for a while and then turned away. The sky opened up the way it does in the west, high and blue and enormous, with the specific quality of light that makes you feel, for a moment, like the world is large enough to hold whatever you are carrying. His left hand rested on the wheel. It trembled, faintly, intermittently, the way it would probably always do now. He drove with it anyway. Back in Detroit, in a small office on the 5th floor of a shared workspace building in Midtown, Sonia Cross was reviewing a set of financial documents that had arrived in her inbox that morning. The Q3 numbers from the Wisconsin company were more interesting than the Q4 ones. There was a pattern in the vendor payments in months 7 through 9 that didn't match any of the supply agreements on file. She wrote in her notebook. Pattern similar to GS but earlier stage, less sophisticated. Check director history. She looked at the notes for a moment. Then she typed a reply to the email address she had saved under the initials MV. The Wisconsin situation is bigger than it looks. The Q3 vendor payments are the story. If you want, I can put together a preliminary pass this week. She sent it. She didn't sit waiting for a response. She went back to work. 40 minutes later, her phone showed a reply. Yes, take whatever time you need. I trust your process. She read it twice. Then she smiled. Just slightly, the way a person smiles when something lands exactly where they didn't realize they were hoping it would. And she opened a new folder on her desktop, labeled it with a case number, and got to work. Outside, Detroit was doing what Detroit does. Moving, building, sustaining itself, indifferent to the specific dramas of any single person standing at any single window. Not everyone's story has a clean ending. Some stories have the ending that is simply true, the one where you did what damage was yours to do, and you faced what consequences were yours to face, and you sent a letter to the person you should have found 15 years ago, and you drove 3 days across the country to sit at a table in the afternoon and say, I know, I should have looked harder. Some stories have the ending where the tremor is still there, and the wall is down, and the water bottle is on the floor where it belongs, and the folded paper is in the right pocket. Some stories have the ending where a woman you barely know kisses you in a kitchen at 1 in the morning, and then tells you something that changes the way you understand every relationship you've ever had, and then goes back to her chair as if it's the most ordinary thing, because for her it is, because she has always been that kind of person. Those endings are not perfect. They are considerably better than perfect. They are true. And a story that is true, even when it is hard, even when it is late, even when it arrives with damage already done and years already spent and trembling already permanent. A story that is true is the one that is worth telling. Take care of yourself. Good night. The story you are about to read is entirely fictional. While it may draw inspiration from universal human experiences, it does not depict real people or actual events. Any perceived parallels are coincidental and should not be interpreted as deliberate representations.
There is a moment in this story that most people will walk past without stopping. It is not the kiss. It is not the betrayal. It is not even the phone call from Oregon. It is the moment Marcus Vail looks at his trembling hand and for the first time in 8 months does not cover it. That moment is the entire story. Everything else is just the road that leads there. We spend so much of our lives building walls and calling them strength. We learn early that showing weakness invites danger, that vulnerability is a liability, that the safest version of ourselves is the one that never needs anything from anyone. And for a while, that works. It keeps us standing. It keeps us in control. But here is what the walls actually cost. They cost you the person who would have stayed if you had let them see you. They cost you the questions you should have asked, but didn't, because asking would have meant admitting you didn't already know the answer. They cost you 15 years of a life you could have been living, not because an enemy took them, but because you gave them away quietly, one closed door at a time, to a version of yourself that was never as strong as it looked. Leon is not the villain of this story in the way we usually mean that word. Leon is a warning. He is what happens when love becomes possession, when loyalty becomes control, when the need to keep someone close overrides every other consideration, including their freedom, their truth, and their right to choose. He did not set out to destroy Marcus. He set out to keep him. And the difference between those two things in practice turned out to be nothing at all. Sonia is not the hero either. She is something more useful than a hero. She is a person who saw clearly and did not look away. She did not rescue Marcus. She did not fix him. She simply refused to stand outside the truth of who he was, and in doing that, she gave him something no amount of power could buy. She gave him a witness. The lesson this story carries is not complicated, but it is hard. Real strength is not the absence of vulnerability. It is the willingness to be seen anyway. Real loyalty is not staying because you have to. It is choosing to stay when leaving is possible. And real trust is not given to the person who has been there the longest. It belongs to the person who tells you the truth when telling you the truth cost them something. The tremor in Marcus's hand never went away. He drove across the country with it on the wheel. That is what courage actually looks like. Not the absence of the shaking, the decision to keep driving anyway.